Now, once you have your materials set up, you may also need to change the mapping on a per object basis. Now, there are a number of ways to apply mapping to an object. Let's take a look at how to do projected mapping. Now, typically this is for NURB surfaces, but we can do it in a number of different ways. So let's go ahead and take a look at our little spaceship here. And I want to go ahead and put a label on our little cowl here. Now, if we apply a material to this, such as a Phong, and insert a bitmap, we can, for example, select this one called A109 and open it. And you can see that, well, it maps, but it's kind of mapping as though the object was a sphere. So we've got a seam here right along this right-hand side. And so this is mapping kind of radially around this sphere. And that is because the cowl was created by just lopping the bottom off of a sphere. Now, we could probably do a little bit different than that. So I'm actually going to undo my way out of this. And let's go ahead and create a projected texture. I'm going to select my cowl, and under rendering, I'm going to select a Phong material. Now, in the color channel, I want to add a file. But if I right-click over this, you'll see that by default, it's Create Texture, which basically maps it to the default. If we want, we can create this as what's called a projection. And what that does is it allows us to control exactly how that texture is placed on the object. So let's go ahead and do Create as Projection. And then it gives us a projection box here, but we still need to input the image. So let's go ahead and click on this connection. Brings us to File 1, click on our file folder here, and then we can select A109, open that, and you can see that, okay, it's now on the surface, and it looks a little bit different. And that's because this projection of this material is controlled by this object way down here. So this is always created at the origin, and so we can move this object to control the mapping. So right now, this mapping is straightforward. Well, I actually want to map from the top down, so I'm going to have to rotate this. So I can just use my standard move, rotate, and scale tools to manipulate this object. And if you take a look at this, you'll see that there's a little point coming down from the projection, and that's really the direction of that projection. And you can see in the transform attributes that I'm rotating around X. So I just want to make X to be -90, and that'll put it straight up and down. So now I can start placing this. So I can just move this on top of the cowl so it's pointing down. But again, it's too small, so I'm going to scale it using my scale tools. And these are just standard Maya tools that I'm using. So I'm just scaling this object, and as I scale it up, you can see how it scales up the texture. If it's too low, I'm going to get a tile on the texture from where it overlaps. So I want to make sure that it's big enough. And then I want to control the placement of this so that it's centered to where I want it to be. So now that I've got this placed, I have this texture object here that's now projecting this texture down. And my texture is placed exactly the way that I want it. But this is a separate object, so I can take this object and move it around. If I look in the outliner, you'll see that I've got this place 3D texture object. So if I take my saucer and I move it around, I'm actually moving it through the texture. Now this can be great for special effects, but if I want this to move with my object, I need to take this place 3D texture object and make it a child of whatever I'm going to be moving. So in this case, the saucer, or actually the cockpit of the saucer. So now when I move this around, the texture projection also moves around and everything stays together. So those are some of the basics of how to create projected textures. Now remember, the texture projector is a separate object, so you need to make sure that you manage that properly.